Hey, what's happening today, Push Kids? We're back for our next lecture in AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topic 5.6, the failure of compromise. Our learning objective today is objective 5G, explain the political causes of the Civil War. We've got a few key ideas we're going to start off with today. All right, our first key idea says the courts and national leaders made a variety of attempts to resolve the issue of slavery in the territories, including the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision. But these ultimately failed to reduce conflict. And key idea number 2, the second party system ended when the issue of slavery and anti-immigrant nativism weakened loyalties to the two major parties and fostered the emergence of sectional parties, most notably the Republican Party in the North. So this is all kind of be the lead up to the beginning of the American Civil War. So we'll cover the time period from essentially about 1854 to 1860, right at the eve of the Civil War. Now, sectionalism in the antebellum era. So let's just kind of review here. These regional differences are going to increase sectionalism. That is the placing of your interests of the region above the interests of the nation. Now, between 1820 and 1850, we see sectionalism is fairly mild. It's resolved generally by compromise. And those dates are kind of important, right? 1820 and then 1850. We have the Compromise of 1820 or the Missouri Compromise, and then the Compromise of 1850. They're resolve, generally speaking, these issues of sectionalism. And then between 1850 and 1856, we see the growth of abolitionism, Western expansion, and it's going to intensify, especially the issue of over the morality of slavery. And then between 1856 and 1860, the issue of slavery becomes unreconcilable. They're not going to be able to solve their differences, and this leads to the Civil War. But we're going to start today's story in 1854. Now, in 1854, Congress is going to pass a law from a guy named Stephen A. Douglas, all right, otherwise known as the Little Giant. He's the senator from Illinois. And it's going to be called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this is all because we've got lots of people moving westward. And now we're starting to spill to the other side of Missouri, the other side of Arkansas, all right, into what was called the Kansas Territory, which will become the state of Kansas. And what they're going to do is they're going to split the rest of that Louisiana Purchase territory into two regions. The Nebraska Territory, which is the area from Nebraska up into the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, that entire region will become the Nebraska Territory, and the bottom part will become the Kansas Territory. And essentially what they're going to do, what Stephen Douglas's idea is they're going to use what's called popular sovereignty. We talked about it before with the Compromise of 1850, and this gives the residents of the territory the right to determine slavery. However, to be able to do this, they're going to have to repeal or end the Missouri Compromise line in the Western territories. That Missouri Compromise line had said that that region, which would become Kansas, would be free to slavery. But now you're going to open it up and let the people there vote. Now, in the North, free soilers especially were outraged by this Kansas-Nebraska Act, because this would open up at least the potential to allow slavery to go into an area where slavery had already been outlawed under the Missouri Compromise. And what this really leads to is this leads to many Northerners forming the Republican Party. And it becomes committed, the Republican Party becomes committed to really this idea of a free soil movement. Now, the Republican Party brought together, and I know it's kind of hard to see on the chart there, but what's happening, the Republican Party, which is that red line, is the combination of a few different groups are coming together. We see not only free soilers, but former Northern Whigs are coming together to form the Republican Party. Now, Southern Whigs are going to start to defect and go to the Democratic Party. They're going to leave to go to the Democratic Party. The Know-Nothings, that's an anti-immigrant party, will stay kind of on their own up until the election of 1860. So they don't join just yet, but they're about to. Now, popular sovereignty, however, though, is going to fail to settle the slavery question in the West. Stephen A. Douglas's idea will fail. So how does it fail? So let's kind of go into that. Now, so he proposes his bill in 1854. And so in 1855, there is a vote in Kansas to decide on the issue of slavery. The problem is, though, is that the vote doesn't go very well. Voting protocols weren't very good back in this day, and a lot of people voted illegally. In fact, thousands of people, residents from Missouri, are going to illegally vote in the Kansas election. And entire groups in Kansas will start to organize themselves in either to pro-slavery or anti-slavery factions. Those pro-slavery Missourians that are sneaking across the border, they don't sneak very well. They were called border ruffians. You've got pro-slavery Missourians voting in Kansas as well at this particular time. And entire towns, entire regions became kind of aligned with either the pro-slavery or this anti-slavery movement. Now, the illegal vote in Kansas gave Kansas slavery even when its residents voted against it. The cartoon that you see right here is, a lot of people think this is Abraham Lincoln. It's not. It's forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. This idea that even though the people of Kansas didn't want slavery, they're being forced to accept it because of this illegal vote. Because of this conflict, in 1856, we're going to see a little mini civil war break out in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups. This becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. And there's a couple really kind of famous incidents. For instance, border ruffians will attack the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was a town almost pretty much entirely made up of anti-slavery or free soil people. They burned the town to the ground, killing several. In response to this, a man who had moved from Massachusetts all the way to Kansas simply to vote and try and keep Kansas from becoming a slave state. I mean, that takes commitment. Like, I'm going to take my entire family, 1,500 miles across the country just to cast a vote. That means you're a committed person. This guy's name was a guy named John Brown. And what John Brown's going to do is he's going to take him and several of his sons, and they go to a nearby town and they start dragging people, pro-slavery people, out of their homes and hacking them to death with broadswords. It becomes known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. Now, because of what happens in Kansas, this Bleeding Kansas is portrayed and commemorated by the John Stuart Curry mural that's still at the Kansas State House. We can see John Brown is pictured in the middle. In one hand, he holds a Bible, and in another hand, he holds a gun. You see images of Kansas in the background of things like the Oregon Trail, prairie fires, a tornado. We're not in Kansas anymore. But then around him, at his feet, you see images from the Civil War, in many ways kind of commemorating this idea that the Civil War in many ways starts in Kansas with John Brown. Now, by the way, the outspread arms that he has and the Bible and the page that it's open to are indicative of Moses. And so this idea that John Brown is going to be a Moses-like figure, he saw himself as a Moses-like figure trying to bring slaves to freedom, just like Moses had done in the Bible. Now, the violence in Kansas, though, this little mini civil war that's happening in 1856 in Kansas, is going to start to spread to other parts of the nation. And it spreads even onto the floor of the U.S. Senate. After giving a short speech against a speech that was called The Crime Against Kansas, Charles Sumner, who is from Massachusetts, who you see is on the floor, is attacked by a guy named Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks is defending not only Southern chivalry, but also defending a relative of his that Charles Sumner had directly insulted in his speech. So, although Brooks had offered to duel Charles Sumner, Sumner had turned him down, and so on the floor in the Senate chamber, with friends who held back onlookers, Brooks will beat Sumner mercilessly with a cane for a full minute. Brooks, after breaking his cane, calmly walks out of the chamber. The cartoon, all right, is this idea that in the North, Preston Brooks becomes really the personification of the enraged and violent Southern slaveholder stereotype. Cartoons like this appear all over the North, portraying Brooks as the faceless animal assaulting the defenseless Sumner. Now, in the South, Brooks becomes a hero. When a rumor started that he had broken his cane while beating Sumner, people from all over the South sent him replacement canes. One of them had the famous etching, "Hit him again." Just hilarious. And also kind of sad. Now, that same year, the election of 1856 is going to happen. Now, it's the first time that the political parties are going to represent regions of the country, not the nation. We see Republicans in the North and Democrats in the South. And slavery becomes the most important political issue in American politics at the time. Now, the Democratic candidate from the South, a guy named Buchanan, will win the presidency. And even though Republicans are going to lose in 1856, they realized that they had enough electoral votes to win the presidency without Southern support. In 1857, the courts will become involved as well. And a major court case in 1857 will further escalate tensions between North and South. A slave named Dred Scott in 1857 will sue for his freedom. He's pictured there on the left-hand side. Now, the background of this case is that what had happened was Dred Scott was a slave to a U.S. Army surgeon. That Army surgeon had traveled from Missouri, where he was based at, had traveled to Illinois, Wisconsin, had gone even to the Minnesota Territory, and then back to Missouri, and had taken Dred Scott, his slave, with him. Now, Dred Scott, who, unlike many slaves at this time, was educated and was trained, sued for his freedom, saying that since he had been taken to a free territory where slavery was illegal, that his status as a slave had ended when he had been taken into a free territory. Now, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it presented the Supreme Court with two major questions. The first question was, does Congress have the power to decide on the issue of slavery in the territories? And was the Missouri Compromise, which had created those free states and created the free territory of Minnesota, was it constitutional? And so in 1857, they come down with their ruling. And what they rule is the following. Number one, they rule that Dred Scott had no right to sue because black people were not citizens of the United States, nor were they ever intended to be citizens of the United States. And secondly, that Congress did not have the power to stop slavery in the Western territories, so the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Now, the reasoning was this, is that slaves were property, and that according to the Constitution, according to the Fifth Amendment, the government could not take away someone's property. So therefore, since slaves were property, you could take them wherever you wanted because the government could not take them away. Northern abolitionists were furious because essentially what this ruling does is it expands slavery. Look at the maps on the left-hand side. The area in purple is the area where slavery was open to prior to the Dred Scott ruling. Because of the Dred Scott ruling, see how much territory slavery has expanded to. And remember, the biggest issue in the North, the biggest issue for the Republican Party at this time was free soil, preventing the spread of slavery. The Dred Scott case vastly expanded the available land that slavery could move into. And this became the central issue in 1858. In 1858, the Senate debate in Illinois becomes incredibly influential and of national prominence. The Democrat, Stephen A. Douglas, is going to be running for re-election. He's going to be running against a young upstart congressman, a lawyer from Springfield, Illinois, named Abraham Lincoln for this Illinois Senate seat. Now, Lincoln is nationally unknown at this time. Now, he's well known in local politics. He's well known in Sangamon County in Illinois, which is where the state house is located at. But during the campaign, he's going to argue that Congress had to stop the spread of slavery. It's the free soil argument. Now, Lincoln will lose the Senate election. Stephen A. Douglas will win re-election. But the argument against slavery is going to make Lincoln a national political figure. Probably the most famous part of his argument is in this quote right here. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe that this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. And this will set up the spark in 1859. Once again, enter John Brown, the man that we talked about from the Potawatomi Massacre during Bleeding Kansas. In 1859, John Brown is going to lead an unsuccessful raid on the federal armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's an attempt, remember we talked about him wanting to be kind of this Moses figure. He wanted to free slaves in a massive slave uprising. His entire idea was to grab this large federal arsenal where we kept, U.S. Army guns, is what an arsenal is, and that slaves would hear about his seizing of the arsenal, they would grab the guns, and he would start this massive rebellion in the South, even escaping to fight a guerrilla warfare in the mountains if need be. Unfortunately, his plan doesn't go so well, and him as well as most of his other collaborators are captured. Many of them are killed. Now, in this entire thing, Brown not only is caught, but he's eventually executed, and he's hanged by the neck until dead, very famously. But Brown, in his death and in his execution, becomes incredibly important. In the North, he's seen by many as a martyr to the cause. However, in the South, he's seen as the epitome of Northerners wanting to use violence to end slavery. Now, when we come back next time, we're going to talk about the next event, the election of 1860, which sparks that Civil War that we're going to begin to talk about. So, in conclusion today, we've talked about all of these events leading up to the start of the Civil War, which will happen, and the first shot's been fired in 1861. As sectional conflicts increasingly divide North and South over the issue of the expansion of slavery, beginning with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, leading to Bleeding Kansas, the election of 1856, the Dred Scott case, the Illinois election, and then John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. Until next time, go Pack.